Welcome to The Third Space, a show where we strive to reclaim the vital realm between home and workplace, igniting transformative conversations in the pursuit of wisdom. I'm your host, Avi, and my guest today is Simon Holloway. Simon is the Manager of Adult Education and Academic Engagement at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. He holds a PhD from the University of Sydney in Classical Hebrew and Biblical Studies, and a Master's in Ancient History. I hope you enjoy today's conversation. You came into my radar because I recently attended a talk that you gave at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, which was excellently titled Learning Torah with the Fuhrer, Nazi Readings of the Talmud. Could you provide a short summary for our listeners about the talk that you gave?
Sure, with pleasure. Look, it might be a little bit of a strange thing, I suppose, to be fascinated by, but I do find very interesting the ways in which propagandists working for the Nazi Party made use of rabbinic literature, given that there were not a small number of individual Nazi Party members who professed some degree of familiarity with that literature. All I really wanted to do was to seek to expose what are the ways that they were using and misusing it. And it's something that I first became interested in several years ago when I discovered that that there were people who actually were devoting a not insignificant amount of time to studying the Talmud, and in some instances may indeed have actually fallen prey to their own unfamiliarity with it. They thought that they were interpreting something as it maybe needed to be interpreted, but were making various mistakes, taking things out of context. And of course, there are a number of instances in which they quite clearly were manhandling the text, were deliberately mistranslating or misinterpreting passages. And so that talk that you attended was one in which I sought to present a little bit of an overview as to the various ways in which the Talmud can be understood, and to look at the various ways in which it can be misunderstood, with examples drawn from Nazi-era propaganda.
Yeah, I remember when the talk finished, I came and asked you about how this kind of like intellectual Nazi academics interacted with, the common anti-Semite on the street, and you said that the commoners were emboldened by the research and the findings that these academics gave. And I think I was reflecting on it afterwards. I think it got me thinking about something I learned from Jonathan Haidt, if you've heard of him. He's a New York University professor of social psychology, I believe, and his expertise is the psychology of morality. And one of his central points in his book, The Righteous Mind, is that he makes the claim that when we make a moral judgment, we think we use reason and logic to come to our position, but we actually use intuition and then fortify that position with reason and logic. So I wonder, like, in when you were delving into this particular topic and you were exploring, like pivotal figures such as the German priest, you mentioned Johannes Paul. People like that, did you find that they were kind of coming at it from like this a priori position of visceral reaction or distaste of Jews?
He's a curious one. So the man that you've mentioned, I don't know enough about, I regret to say, to be able to comment really on what initially drove him towards this sort of an approach, because given that he had originally done a doctorate in Messianism in the book of Ezekiel, and in as much as he had done this postdoctoral work on Israelite society in ancient times, may indeed have been somebody who had originally set out with the best of intentions and had become himself convinced by various ideas that were part of that sort of general mindset of the time. But certainly when it comes to other individuals, so people, for example, like Alfred Rosenberg, who was a very early Nazi Party ideologue, one of the individuals who established the Nazi Party, whose writings on the Aryan myth and whose writings on the Talmud in the 1920s were also very formative in terms of Nazi Party anti-Semitism. I don't think that he approached things with what we might think of as the best of intentions. He's coming with that a priori assumption, and it's intellectuals like himself as well as those later on, like Johannes Paul, who are, as you suggested, emboldening the rest of the population and allowing them to also justify those a priori assumptions that they have, on the basis of this understanding that there are people out there who are conducting that research that substantiates those ideas. I don't need to actually conduct that research myself.
Right, yeah. I'd like to come back to the mechanisms of how like we use intuition to form our moral judgments potentially later on. But I want to kind of jump into talking about anti-Semitism more broadly. It's actually something that I've recently been very focused on, as opposed to in the past when maybe I shied away from it because it's something that, like, growing up Jewish, you hear about so much anyways that like you don't need to dive into it directly. But recently I've been doing my own research. Might have actually been brought forward by the book People Love Dead Jews by
Dara Horn.
Dara Horn, yeah. My wife just finished reading it and she's been talking about it a lot. So it's probably fresh in my head from that. But in doing the research that I have been on anti-Semitism, I've come to realize that it's kind of hard to pin down what exactly it is. Like coming to a concise definition or like putting a circle around what exactly constitutes anti-Semitism or not is not really agreed upon, even in academic circles. And I wonder if it's related to how anti-Semitism evolves over time, like in the pre-Christian era, how it was then, and then Christian informed anti-Semitism, and then even coming forward to modern times where we live in a more secular world, like post-Christian in many ways, but it's kind of morphed away into a kind of anti-Zionism or being critical of the Israeli government. So can you talk about how anti-Semitism has evolved from your understanding?
Look, first of all, I agree. Certainly, it's my perception of the matter as well, that it is something that has continually changed and evolved and metastasized in various ways, and it's therefore perhaps a bit of a misnomer to think of this historical anti-Semitism, what we refer to as anti-Semitism when we're thinking about the modern era, if we're thinking about the 19th, 20th centuries, is such a different beast to that which had preceded it. It's in some quarters certainly religiously motivated, but it's now taken on more of a kind of a racial, biological nuance. There is more so of that, economic allegation that Jews are preternaturally disposed towards dominating in any economic structure and asserting their will over non-Jewish people, and it also takes on more of a kind of an apocalyptic notion as well. This idea that there is this ultimate plan of world domination by which they're going to conquer the globe, and if we compare that to earlier forms of anti-Semitism, or sort of anti-Semitism, we find that in those earlier years that Judeophobia, or whatever you want to call it, had more of a religious nuance. The Jews could convert. In theory, if Jews were to convert, then that would be a way of getting rid of Jewish influence and Jewish culture and so forth, which of course no longer becomes possible once we enter that kind of racial, biological mode of anti-Semitism. So by the time the term itself gets invented, and by the time the word anti-Semitism itself becomes popularized, it's now in reference to that biological concept, that there is something about Jews that is inherited, and conversion isn't going to change it. Acculturation and assimilation, these things are not going to change it. It's something innate to Jewish character.
Right, and there's nothing you can do to run away from it.
No. And of course, by the time we get now to the these events in the towards the middle of the 20th century, the first plan, of course, that the Nazis had was just simply one of mass expulsion, just get them gone. It's only once we get to that final solution to the Jewish problem that they create sort of an apocalyptic model to match what they perceive now as an apocalyptic threat.
I've heard of a lot of people debate whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and for me, I find it a bit difficult to pass through that one, because theoretically, I disagree. I don't think they're the same. But practically speaking, I do think they're the same in a lot of ways. And like, theoretically speaking, it's possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. Like, think of the ultra-Orthodox community. A lot of them reject the state of Israel on the grounds that they don't believe that it can be formed based off like social or political modes. It needs to come from like a more religious or from God himself in Messianic times. You know, simultaneously, it's possible to be anti-Semitic and not be anti-Zionist. I mean,
Certainly,
if you
yes.
look at pre-Israel times, there were a lot of European political figures who had very explicit anti-Semitic views, and it was because of those views that they wanted the Jews to get out of Europe and go into the land of Israel.
Well, if we think of pre-state Zionism, there were a great many Jewish people beyond those whose objection to Zionism was religious in nature, who professed an anti-Zionist perspective. The Bundists, for example, as part of their core ideological doctrine, opposed the establishment of a state. There were significant numbers of Jewish people throughout Europe, throughout the world, who continue to oppose the notion of statehood even after the declaration of a state, who didn't subscribe to the Zionist ideal and who might have rejected Israel. And I think there still are today groups of people who are supportive of Israel, but who are nonetheless anti-Semitic, and who believe that by supporting Israel, they will usher in some kind of end times that they profess a belief in, that will see ultimately an eradication of Judaism as a distinct culture or
are you referring to like evangelical?
Certainly,
Christians?
I think that's but I think in terms of differentiating them one from another, in terms of knowing when a person speaks against Israel, whether or not they are themselves anti-Semitic, the fact that it is difficult to do so doesn't necessarily mean that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are one and the same thing. I think they are quite distinct. I think part of the challenge, however, is that by and large, as a general rule, people who are anti-Semitic are also anti-Israel. And given the tenor of comments that people will sometimes make about the state of Israel, it can become very difficult to know where that person is coming from. And I think the lived experience that Jewish people have had over the last century is one that has taught people to be wary. And if people tend to assume the worst, I think that's something of a survival mechanism, that while I too might find it frustrating sometimes when people do assume the worst in a situation, they hear something and rhetorically they assume that this person is coming from a position that they may not themselves be coming from. I at least appreciate why people may have developed a tendency to do that when so much of that rhetoric is so nasty.
When I asked you that question in the lecture that you gave, I was referring to an essay that was written by Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist. In his the essay was titled "Anti-Semite and Jew," and he basically said that Jews have been the perennial scapegoats throughout history, and this is probably what explains like that mindset that we were talking about. And it serves the anti-Semite, he claims, an important purpose in defining their identity. Because in defining the Jew as the enemy of the state and opposed to the values and the culture and the tradition and even like the racial purity of the state, he implicitly defines himself then as the possessor of the land and protector of the values of the state. And there's this amazing line that he has in the essay, I'm sure you've heard it. He says, if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. This is excellent. To what extent do you agree that, or do you think that Jews have been like uniquely singled out amongst other repressed minorities as a target for violence and discrimination, and why do you think that's the case?
Look, I always feel a little uncomfortable with these what's the word I'm looking for? These sorts of pretensions of uniqueness, because there is certainly something unique to the Jewish experience. There is that which is unique to every cultural experience, and to every ethnic group, and to every minority, and to every religious experience. There is that about it which is unique. And if we're thinking about history, and even were we just to limit our discussion to Europe, of scapegoating, there are other communities as well that have experienced a long history of scapegoating. So if we're thinking about the experiences of Sinti and Roma peoples, pejoratively referred to as gypsies, this long history of their being blamed for everything from the plague through to the disappearance of children, the same sorts of things that Jewish communities had been blamed for as well. There's a lot of parallels there, and I picked them just as one example. I think there's a lot of different groups concerning which they inhabit that same position of other. There is something about them that is unassimilable. They're not part of the state, and so I think the observations that Sartre makes when he talks about the Jew needing to be invented, something about the Jewish experience that made it perhaps different was the number of Jews that were found throughout the continent, not just on the margins of society, but by the time that he was writing, really entrenched at various levels of European society, and that are nonetheless experiencing that othering. They're aliens in states that they have helped to build and establish and usher into modernity, and it's as we know, becomes a very precarious position for them. They're very visible, out of respect to their actual numbers. They're very visible within society, again, that's really a function of the modern world. Prior to that, they were perhaps less visible, but still subject to that scapegoating, that othering, that treats of them as an alien, treats of them as something that is to be feared and despised.
Yeah. It also seems to me like they're kind of despised from multiple angles as well. I mean, the horseshoe theory of politics. Have you heard of it before? So it's this theory that the political continuum, people tend to think of it as a straight line, and on one end you've got the far right, and then you've got the center, and then as you move to the other end you got the far left. But it's probably more helpful to think of it as a kind of horseshoe, because as you move away from the center, the far left and the far right start to actually have quite a lot in common in the way they act. Maybe in the same way they tend to think in like totalitarian ways. I heard this other phrase that was so funny and so excellent, that I want to map onto this horseshoe model, which is the phrase Schrodinger's whites. Have you heard of that?
No.
So Schrodinger's whites is this notion that Jews are both white and non-white, depending on your political orientation. So if you're on the far right, you consider the Jews to be non-white because they're this impure race that's polluting the purity of the Aryan pool, and they're an inferior subspecies or something like that. And then on the far left, they are considered to be white because they're part of this sort of patriarchal elite ruling class,
which is nothing new.
Yeah,
we've witnessed this phenomenon for a long time, and I think it's sort of where we started off today. You mentioned the degree to which anti-Semitism changes and morphs and evolves, and just as sort of a shifting and variable is the anti-Semite's perception of the Jew, that they can inhabit multiple roles simultaneously, and so in the eyes of conservative elites, Jews are left-wing socialist revolutionaries fermenting for some kind of complete upheaval of society, whereas in the eyes of the left, Jews are to be represented with the conservative old guard. They're like middlemen to the people that actually hold power. Both sides see them as a threat. Both sides see them as something damaging their own aspirations, but they see them as things that are completely mutually irreconcilable. Like you can't be both. You can't be both a Zionist and a communist, for example. But the Nazis will talk about Jews as Zionists, as communists, as Talmudists. They don't seem to perceive that what they're describing are these mutually conflicting zones of experience. The Jew is the capitalist, the Jew is the socialist.
Simultaneously.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a new thing. We just happen to see it very, very strongly when it comes to Nazi-era propaganda. We find this in the Soviet propaganda, and we find this before Nazi Germany. We find this in periodicals issued in France and in Poland, and it's an old notion that when you have a group of people that you need to be other, then they will change depending on what you need that other to be.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just had this random thought come to my mind. I don't know if I'm overreaching here, but I've been listening to this University of Toronto professor recently. His name is John Vervaeke, and he's very focused on this project of bringing people back to old notions of ancient wisdom and practices and stuff like that. And one thing he talks about is the concept of the intercategorical, which is a thing that exists between categories, and it's hard to really put a label on it because it doesn't map on very well.
Okay.
And he says that as humans, one thing that the way that we respond to the intercategorical things is to find them weird or distasteful or even disgusting. And he actually, funnily enough, cites the Torah itself, how they have the description of unclean or impure animals. And he says that the ones that are this list that is compiled of these unclean animals is a result of the fact that it's been identified that they don't, the ones that have a particular shape or a way of movement or appearance that doesn't match where they're located, we find very strange. Like things that are underwater, fish that have they don't have fins and scales that exist underwater is very weird for us, right? So yeah, this concept of the intercategorical, I wonder if the Jew kind of maps onto that in some way, like because it's hard to kind of put us down and label us as a thing. We're white, but we're not Christian. We come from the Middle East, but we're not Muslim. Like what really are we? So that's something maybe you can riff off as well. I also know this really good joke from Jerry Seinfeld. He says, I think it touches on this perfectly. He says, when you have a full head of hair, it's really beautiful. Like you want to touch it, you want to caress it, you want to kiss it. But as soon as a single hair manages to dislodge itself from the skull and go forth on its own, suddenly it's repulsive, disgusting. So I really think that perfectly sums up this like thing that we're talking about.
Well, every one of my hairs has managed to go forth on its own, so that it resonates with me. I think that idea of people being in this sort of liminal space is interesting. I don't know that I necessarily agree with the description of in terms of kashrut, in terms of those animals. I need to think a little bit more about that.
Sure.
But certainly, from a sociological perspective, people who are maybe sort of like us, but not quite like us, it prompts a certain degree of something maybe disconcerting about it. And I think one of the curious phenomena that we see, so far as Jews are concerned, is post-Enlightenment, post their emancipation. Jews are leaving villages, they're moving into cities, they are reaping the rewards of general society. We witness, as a result of that, the largest voluntary mass conversion from Judaism to Christianity in the history of both religions, that in spite of these pretenses that Jews can now engage with broader society as Jews, the reality is baptism still serves as the ticket to society. But Jews are finding ways in large numbers to also hold on to elements of Jewish culture and Jewish tradition, and they might be shedding a lot of those traditions, but they're maintaining enough of the culture to still seem to in the eyes of other observers to still seem different, to still be
Yes.
perceived as clannish,
Yes.
that there's something about them that is distinct and is resented then in the eyes of those people who perceive Jews as foreigners taking the best jobs, as interlopers, not real Germans, not really French. And
Sure.
there's a lot of people throughout this period who are very eloquently and sophisticatedly rejecting those sorts of notions. And I think, it's fair to say that even in like the 1920s, it's perceived as very lowbrow to be really publicly advancing those sorts of ideas that, we're all a little bit beyond that. And so it's one of the curious, I suppose, phenomena of history that an organization like that of the Nazi Party, which was perceived by many Germans as the punchline to a joke, this sort of thuggery and this really lowbrow lack of engagement with the ideas of the time, should come for a whole host of different reasons to become sufficiently popular that they can win an election, that they can form a government and bring those sorts of ideas into the public space. And it's part of the tragedy, I suppose, that so many of those people who rejected those ideas didn't reject them strongly enough that they were a sticking point. They could tolerate them, even if they thought that they were foolish, and even if they thought that they were wrong. They could put up with them, and that's I suppose that's the tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You touched on the point again there that being Jewish is not something that we can easily shake. The same essay that I mentioned before from Sartre, he talks about the inauthentic Jew as one who tries to deny his Jewishness and try and distance himself from the faults ascribed to him by anti-Semitic rhetoric.
That itself, I have to say, is a controversial idea.
Yeah.
Because I think it's reasonable to suggest, not talking about this from a religious standpoint, not thinking of this in terms of the halakha as to who is a Jew, but from a purely social and a cultural vantage point, that a person has the right to repudiate a part of their identity and for that not to be who they are. And I think we have an obligation to take people at face value when they say, who and what they are. And so I think the idea that, a Jew who denies their own Jewishness and seeks to be a part of something else is in some sense an inauthentic Jew is, from my perspective, quite a problematic
thing to say.
Viewpoint.
But
it also ascribes to this idea that being a Jew, there is something essentialist to that, that is fundamentally who and what they are, and they can't leave it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I was reading that, I was kind of reminded of a lot of people that I actually know personally who were raised in a very religious environment and are kind of running away from this identity that's part of who they are. And it would probably, I don't know, maybe I'm out of my place to say this, but it might serve them well to have a bit more of an acceptance towards it.
I've no doubt. But who Sartre has in mind might not even be those sorts of people, but also people who are born to parents who had converted to Christianity. That they are denying their Jewish origins, but that's not really for us to say whether they are denying something if their lived experience is one of embracing that which they do know. It's to suggest that they're denying something, I think, skirts very dangerously close to those ideas that there is something biologically significant about them, and something essentialist, that it denotes certain characteristics that they're suppressing, but which are there because of what they are.
I'm going to go a little bit off the cuff here, just because I had this other thought. Do you believe in the concept of a Jewish soul, as opposed to just everyone being instantiated with a soul?
If I hesitate over answering this question, it's only because I don't find it easy to so simply encapsulate what I believe when it comes to issues of a religious nature. I feel that my relationship with that is perhaps a little too nuanced to be so easily put into words. And if I were to say, yes, I believe this, or no, I don't believe this, either way, I will be mischaracterizing my opinions. And my response would be the same if you ask me a question about my belief in God. For example, I think it's just a little bit difficult to put into something, to put into a soundbite.
Sure, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's actually something that I'm kind of getting more of an appreciation of in my own religious journey.
Yeah.
There's a lot that exists beneath the propositional level that
Absolutely.
that you feel and you embody, but
Absolutely, and there's
to
much
put into words it is just
there's much as well from a religious standpoint that I voluntarily subscribe to particular beliefs in as much as they are part of a framework that makes sense in accordance with those beliefs, and in which they become part of a sort of a logical whole. But outside of that framework, I wouldn't necessarily profess a belief in them in quite the same way, which maybe doesn't quite make sense. I appreciate that may be a little bit of a word salad.
No, that makes sense to me. Yeah, sure. I'll get us back on track in that case. That was just a temporary thought spark that I had. I want to read a quote to you now and get your take on it. It's from a short essay by Mark Twain. It's called Concerning the Jews. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?
When I first heard this quote, I loved it. Who doesn't like being told that they're special? I think there's something about it that one can hear and feel inspired by, and feel perhaps maybe that they agree with or would like to agree with. It's a sentiment that struck me at the time as a flattering one. Having had occasion to think about it a little more, and I make no remarks as regards Mark Twain himself, because actually, to be perfectly frank, don't know in general what his attitudes were towards Jews, but just taking that quote in and of itself, I can't quite tell whether he has a positive view of Jews or a negative one, because there are statements that he makes there that could be taken in quite a negative tone.
Yeah, like the aggressive mind. Yeah.
Yes, and I think one way or another, it is quite othering. It is quite this, references to the Jew as somebody possessed of particular faculties, somebody who is ineradicable. We've tried to get rid of them. They're still here. I think there are elements of it that, notwithstanding, the time in which he is writing, I think today, in any case, would elicit a certain degree of discomfort to speak about people in that fashion.
Sure.
So I no longer feel that it's quite so flattering as I had once felt, and I now feel a little bit ambivalent as regards this line, and have questions, I suppose, as regards what he meant.
Sure. But I mean, the fact of history remains, surely, no? That there's this almost, we're kind of living in this unending Purim story in a way. There's just like this constant onslaught from one direction or another, and you seem to just get through it somehow.
Look, the idea that, as we say in the Haggadah every year, the idea that in each generation somebody arises who seeks to destroy us, is a particular idea that has support from a number of quarters. And it would be facile to point out that there are also plenty of times in which Jews have been welcomed, and in which they have thrived, and in which they have lived not only in harmony with others, but to the betterment of both. Because the reality is, there are enough instances throughout history that would testify to the notion of Jews being persecuted, to give the truth of that sentiment, I suppose. But the idea that people have sought to eradicate the Jews altogether, I think is going a little too far. That has happened. That has happened in relatively recent history, and that has provided a lens through which we might view previous history. But nobody previously had ever sought to physically exterminate all of the Jews. It's such a repulsive and unthinkable idea that we can appreciate why so many people at the time, even while it was transpiring, couldn't quite get their heads around the fact that this is what was going on. There's no precedent for it. And that persecution that people had experienced had taught them how to respond to persecution, and unfortunately it had taught them things that were of very little assistance when it came to the genocide that was perpetrated in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Accommodating oneself to the ruling powers and doing what is instructed is not actually a way to resist a genocide of that nature, even if it had been a way of dealing with previous forms of persecution. It reflects not only a change in the treatment of Jews, it reflects a change in the very nature of anti-Semitism itself. That if we look at previous forms of anti-Semitism, as some historians refer to it as parliamentary anti-Semitism, this idea that you might get into parliament and then pass various edicts against Jews, limiting their role in public life. And what all parliamentary anti-Semites had experienced is that once you actually get into power, you realize the situation's a little bit more complex than you'd thought, and you need to cooperate with these groups, and you need to appease those groups, and always the greatest successes that these anti-Semitic parties had was right at the very beginning, and then their popularity would decline. And what we see with Nazism is the rise of revolutionary anti-Semitism. It's this idea that the political system itself is dominated by Jews. The state itself is some kind of Jew state. And the only way to actually ameliorate that situation is not by passing laws that limit Jews, but overthrowing the system of government and setting up a whole new government that has that as its sort of foundational principle. And that's not a system that Jews had ever encountered before. This idea that built into the very fabric of the state is this complete and emphatic and uncompromising rejection of not only Judaism, but everybody who comes from a family that had been Jewish, even 2 generations back. You can't accommodate yourself to that in any way. And I think that also just indicates how this, in a sense, was something profoundly new.
Yeah. It's kind of like the grand unifying anti-Semitic theory that they've brought together there. I have this voice on my shoulder telling me, enough with the anti-Semitism and Holocaust stuff, let's move on to other things. And I'm like thinking to myself, why am I thinking that? Why am I so opposed to like what I perceive as like this droning on about anti-Semitism and Holocaust related things? And I wonder if it's related to, I feel like we tend to define ourselves in terms of like the persecution and suffering we face, and it's very reactive, and we don't tend to like have discourse and like and form our identity based off like a more active pride.
I think there is much right now for people to be proud of, and that might serve as a very positive form of people's Jewish identity, and I like to believe it is as well. I do appreciate, certainly in a city like Melbourne with such a large number of Holocaust survivors, one's never really going to get beyond the trauma of the previous generations, and nor do I think we should, incidentally. I think it is something that needs to be understood and can be made also itself into a positive identity. But I think we live in general in a tremendously exciting time. And if one thinks, for example, about how readily available traditional Jewish literature has become, such that quite literally, on devices that one carries in one's pocket, one can engage with sources that had previously been restricted to a minority of people who received a particular degree of training, that we now have broader sections of the Jewish community who are openly engaging with this material and commenting on it, is something that I find very inspiring. If we think about the prophet Isaiah and his vision of a day coming when knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the ocean bed, and I feel like we are living in this time when people are actually, broadly speaking, engaging with so much literature and commenting on it at an unprecedented rate, I think is something that is really remarkable and certainly tremendously inspiring. And I think there is much in terms of Jewish expression that we are finding today, a kind of a reburgeoning of different individualistic modes of expression and a communal, public modes of Jewish expression, which I think is also truly a wonderful thing. And if the events to which you are alluding and that we have been discussing might colour people's Jewish identity, I don't think it's colouring their identity to such a degree that they are staying at home and are fearful of celebrating their Jewishness. I think certainly the Holocaust has the potential to be a negative part of a person's identity, but I think it also has the potential to be a very positive part of their identity too, in as much as it is an opportunity to also consider themes of resilience, to think about resistance, to think about the sorts of choices that people had the capacity to make, and the ways in which those survivors themselves made meaning out of their experiences and went on to build lives for themselves as well. I think there is something there that is very positive, not only in terms of the Jewish experience, but in terms of the human experience and in terms of what a human being is capable of enduring, and what they have the resilience in so many instances to survive and to make meaning out of. I think there is something very beautiful to that as well.
I think you answered my next question. It sounds like you're an optimist in regards to the future of Judaism, broadly speaking.
I think so. I wouldn't necessarily identify as such. I feel that I'm something more of a pragmatist, but I see much reason to be hopeful as regards what the future holds in terms of Jewishness and Jewish identity.
So I want to switch gears now and maybe come back down to earth in some respects. I want to ask you about your personal life and your childhood. If you can talk me through where you were raised and what your environment was like, what your relationship was like with your parents and peers and all that.
Okay. Look, I'm born and bred in Sydney, and come from a traditional family. I, like many young Jews attending Jewish school, experienced what sometimes have been referred to as a kind of a Holocaust exhaustion. There was so much information about the Holocaust, and I at a certain point in my young adulthood feared and rejected what I felt might be a negative form of identity, and was very fixated on building a sort of a positive Jewish identity, which for me personally was very centered around Jewish literature and the study of Jewish literature. After graduating, I spent a period of time in a yeshiva, and I was in a couple of different yeshivot that when I left, I suppose you might say the pendulum swung in the opposite direction for a while, and I, to use the nomenclature that we used in yeshiva, I fried out, and I enrolled at university to pursue a degree in classical Hebrew and biblical studies, which eventually became a PhD, and I during that time started to reawaken in myself a fascination with the rabbinic literature, and I spent a lot of time studying the Mishnah, and subsequently got very seriously back into a study of the Gemara as well, which has been since then a very kind of personal pursuit. I tend to learn on my own, and I quite enjoy that experience, and it kind of went hand in hand with the process of becoming more religiously observant again. For me, studying is a little like davening. It's a very kind of a personal, spiritual experience, but it's quite an intellectual experience that I really enjoy as well. And when I first started working in an environment with Holocaust survivors, to be perfectly frank, I did so because I needed a job, and I took a job at the Sydney Jewish Museum, and I was working at the same time at the University of Sydney as a sessional lecturer. And I discovered over the time that I was working at the museum, and I was at the Sydney Jewish Museum for 6 years, how inspiring were the stories of the survivors with whom I was working. I truly valued the relationship that I developed with some 40 or so Holocaust survivors who were working there in that institution. And I had survivors in my family as well. My mother's family was Hungarian, and so I'd grown up with their stories, but this provided me an opportunity to not only work closely with other survivors, but also to engage a little more critically and intellectually with the historiography of the Holocaust as well, which then became something of a primary focus of mine. And so when the opportunity came here to move to Melbourne, and this is now a little more than a year and a half ago, at late 2021, to work at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, I was very excited for that opportunity, in part because I married a Melbourne girl, and it was always something on the cards that we would move to Melbourne, but also in large part because there's something very exciting, I think, about the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. It's an institution that has existed since 1984, but given that it was undergoing this process of redevelopment and revamping, it felt very much like a new beginning, and was a chance to be in something at the ground level and to help it develop. There's something I think really wonderful about the Melbourne Jewish community that I find very invigorating and very fascinating and very different to Sydney's, in that Melbourne has a little bit of a slice of that interwar Polish Jewish politics that we see represented here in Melbourne. Different of those political positions that existed amongst Jews at that early time, in terms of different forms of Zionism, in terms of different Hasidim, in terms of a Bundist culture within this city, and we've been sending our children to Shalom Aleichem, and it's a really beautiful school. And there's much about Jewish life here in Melbourne in general that I've always found very compelling, and it's certainly a very easy city in which to be Jewish, and so I suppose the rest is history. I've been here now for a little more than a year and a half, and it was a great move coming down.
Sure.
It's better coffee too.
Oh yeah. Except for this instant one, I'm sure.
No, I like this actually.
It's actually alright. I like that imagery of like the continuation of maybe pre-war Polish society now being re-implemented here in Melbourne. That's beautiful. I never thought about that.
There are echoes of it. There's a degree, I think, to which over time things sort of flatten out, and certain ideas become dominant and might cross over, become a sort of interdenominational, if that's really the right word that I'm kind of looking for. But there is something of a continuation there. Yeah. At least, even if only in name, in some instances, which I quite like.
Yeah. I also like how you said when you were younger you had this Holocaust exhaustion, and now things have kind of done a full 180, and you're doing it full time.
Yeah.
I like that's sort of that journey that you've had in your life has led you there. I wanted to maybe quiz you a little bit on you said you got a PhD in biblical studies. Yeah. For me, when I grew up religious, and I went through a sort of teenage rebellion, and I started to explore, let's say, alternative worldviews and perspectives. And I remember one Yom Kippur, I was sitting in shul, and I was reading a book called The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein.
Yes.
Yeah, he's an Israeli archaeologist. Yeah, and I was really, it struck a chord with me, let's say. Yeah, in the sense that it was providing a revisionist account of like biblical events and the history and that cynical view almost that it has. I was drawn to that, like in the sense that it's not really so much about this supernatural description of events that's going on and like this true history, but rather this piece of political propaganda that was used to unite the ancient kingdom of Israel, so I was struck by that and lived with that for a long time. And then I think only recently I'm kind of coming more to wake up to the fact that there's the Torah is a lot deeper than that. There are psychological truths that are deeply encoded in there. And I was actually at a talk at East Melbourne Synagogue on Sunday night by David Solomon. He was talking about the Zohar. And we were going through this one passage where he talked about how the Torah's actually got multiple layers to it. Like at the most superficial layer is the literal story. And then the level beneath that is kind of encoded the way to live a good life. And then, the commandments and all that. And then layer beneath that is sort of a path to a higher wisdom or enlightenment. I don't know if I'm butchering that cross-pollination of ideas there. And then at the very bottom is a glimpse at like the fundamental nature of reality and the single unity uniting everything itself. And so I wonder, from the biblical studies that you underwent, how much of it was regarding the outermost layer of the superficial stories, how much of it was kind of diving a bit deeper into the way to live your life. And okay, we'll start there and then I'll get to the next question.
I think there are fundamentally different ways of approaching a text. I don't personally subscribe to the idea that the academic approach is the outer layer, while another approach might look at the layers beneath that, because I think so far as academics approach text, there are multiple layers to that as well, that they can deal with what is referred to as source criticism, for example, where they engage with the compositional integrity of a text and the various points in time at which the text might have been committed to writing and what its various textual sources were at every one of those stages, and identifying various corruptions in the text and so forth. And you can go, even within that sort of academic method, you can go layers deeper and you can look at what is the final form of the text, what sort of a rhetorical impact did it have, who was its target audience, what are the ways in which it was used. And you alluded to this in Israel Finkelstein when he makes reference not only to the composition of the text, but its use as a piece of propaganda for the purposes of uniting a kingdom. You can go layers below that, and there are academics who will look at what they might refer to as biblical hermeneutics, looking at the text through various types of lenses and reinterpreting the text in various ways. You have feminist hermeneutics, you have Marxist hermeneutics. So I think all of these approaches themselves can be possessed of multiple layers. They all operate from different types of assumptions as to the ultimate purpose of that investigation. And I would really personally like to suggest that there's multiple ways in which we can conceive of truth. And I remain very sympathetic to that academic mode of engagement. And it was something that I had engaged with for a long time. And I don't feel that time was wasted. I feel that I got a tremendous amount out of that process. But I feel that was one type of truth that I was seeking to understand. There are other types of truths. One can believe, as I do, for example, that the exodus from Egypt, the revelation at Sinai, the sojourn in the wilderness, the conquest of the land, those things are all literally true, even if not historically true. And that might sound like an odd sort of distinction, because how can it then be literally true if it didn't happen in history? I don't personally believe that if I could sit in a time machine and go back to a particular point in time, I could witness those events taking place as they are being described. But at the same time, I believe that they're not true just in an allegorical sense or a metaphorical sense, but that they are literally true. And I appreciate there is a tension there. I quite enjoy that tension, to be honest. I think sometimes the tension between things is really where the interesting insights actually occur. And there's a wonderful book, actually, from memory. I think it's by Norman Solomon. I might be incorrect about the title, and I might be incorrect about the author, and I think I'm going to be incorrect about the title as well. And I'm hesitating to say what it's actually called, but he has actually a chapter there where he talks about various types of truth that resonated with me very much. But I think when engaging with things from a religious standpoint, for want of a better way of describing it, when engaging with them from a scientific standpoint, again, for want of a better way of describing it, you're aiming at different types of truth, all of which can be literal, not on different levels, but on really the same level as one another. And I think that oftentimes fairy tales themselves are some of the most pregnant vehicles for truth, and the conveyance of ideas that are literally true.
Sure. And I guess maybe the fact that the Torah itself is so pregnant with multiplicity of truths, maybe that's the reason why it's endured as maybe arguably the most famous book of all time, surely. I want to talk about circumcision.
Okay.
Everyone's favorite topic. It's obviously one of the commandments in the Torah. And to the modern Gen Z Jew, let's say, the rationale that circumcision being a covenant with God sounds probably abstract and highfalutin. I mean, the arguments that you can make against it, that it's barbaric and outdated and nonsensical, are like very obvious and easy to make. And to be honest, it's something I personally struggle with as I come to that stage in life where, I'm starting to look down the barrel of potentially having a child, having a son, and then having to make that decision. And I find that I struggle with it sometimes because I want to circumcise my son. I think that drive comes from somewhere very deep, maybe, I'm not sure exactly. But I find that when I think about it and when I talk about it with friends, it almost seems like we're doing this kind of mental gymnastics, and we're like digging deeper and deeper for like a more clever rationale to justify doing it. Are we missing the point? Are we going about it the wrong way? Is it something that you shouldn't think about, but you should just do? Or...
I don't think there's anything that one should not think about, and I think it's good that people are bothered by it, and seeking to understand it, and are then bothered by the mental gymnastics that they might feel that they are doing in justifying something that they may feel is unjustifiable. I am all for living the examined life. One wants to engage with those things, whatever the outcome is of their decision. And even if the outcome of their decision is, here is a thing, whether circumcision or anything else, that I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it because I feel beholden to a particular system of law that insists upon my doing it, but at least to have that opportunity to analyze, to engage a little bit in the nature of that system and in the nature of one's relationship with it. I think it's a very positive thing to do. I think a terrible thing to do is to turn off that faculty of inquiry and just do something because it needs to be done. I think it's good to wrestle with things, to engage with them a little bit, and ultimately to make one's decision. Even, as I say, at the risk of repeating myself, even if the decision that one makes is, the halacha is X and that's what I'm going to do, to at least have had that experience of engaging with those halachic norms and thinking about them is, I think, a big part of that process.
True. Yeah, and I guess that's probably like the essence of what it means to be Jewish. I mean, doesn't Israel mean he who wrestles with God? That was just the imagery I had when you used that particular word, wrestling. So maybe the process of struggle, even if you decide maybe not to do it, you can't necessarily construe that as not living in accordance with Jewish values, because you're at least struggling with things in a sense. As an initiation rite, though, I feel like it serves an important purpose. There's this well-documented psychological phenomenon that the more grueling and difficult any given initiation rite is, the more bonded the people are subsequently to the group that they are getting initiated into.
If that is so, it is more so an initiation rite for the parents than it is for the child, who will not be mindful of any of these distinctions and will grow up with a sense of normality. The parents are allowing that normality for the child, but they themselves are the ones who are undergoing some kind of statement, some kind of adherence to cultural norms that I think for them, and I can only speak for myself, was very powerful.
Yeah, I guess because like from your perspective, once you do decide to make a big decision like that for the thing that you cherish most in the whole world, it's like all of the subsequent decisions to then, send your kid to a Jewish school and enroll them in various Jewish activities and engage in Jewish festivals and whatnot, that all falls into place because you've already made the much harder decision up front as a parent. Is that kind of the...
Perhaps. I think everybody is different in this regard, and I think something that you will find as I find, as I'm sure other parents find, is that there are continual processes of engaging one's children and a continual opportunity to acculturate them to various types of norms. It doesn't necessarily relate to schooling, life within a general Jewish society, and in the home there are lots of opportunities to reflect those ideas, to celebrate those sorts of ideas.
Okay, I'm just looking at the clock where we're getting close to the end.
Sure.
I do want to ask you one last question, and it's a bit of a fun question, or maybe just something that just to reflect on more generally. But what things do you wish to persist beyond your death?
Goodness. Look, I would like, in general, I hope that this is an answer to your question, I would like in general to see more critical engagement with Jewish literature. I would like to witness during my lifetime more of an increase in the number of people who connect with this literature and identify with it as something that belongs to them. I think what oftentimes happens is people who feel to some degree alienated by that material say, this doesn't speak to me, it doesn't belong to me, I'm not interested in it, and I think it's a terrible shame. I think that in as much as it is a person's birthright, I think what I would like to see is a degree to which people are more empowered to say, look, these are the things in this literature that bother me, but they're mine and they belong to me, and no one has the right to tell me how I should relate to them or how I should interpret them, but as a personal thing for themselves to at least make this something that is their own. I would like to see that during my lifetime, and I would certainly hope that that would be something that would continue beyond my lifetime, that there might continue to be this resurgence of interest in those sorts of materials.
Beautiful. Simon, it's been an absolute honor
Thank
to
you,
speak to you today. I appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure.